So hi, my name is Alvin Huang. I'm an educator, architect, and designer. I'm the director of graduate architecture and post-professional architecture here at the USC School of Architecture in Los Angeles. I also am an associate professor here and lead a small design studio called Synthesis Design and Architecture based in, well, we used to be based in downtown LA. Now post-pandemic, we are based in virtual space, but yeah. So I first got into architecture by way of my father. My father has a graduate degree in architecture. He has a master's of architecture, but he never practiced. So my father became a general contractor and worked in the construction industry for many, many years. And through my father, I got an interest in building and making things. And I've always liked to draw, and I've always liked the act of creation and creativity. And I think I got a real flavor for kind of visual language through my interest in sneaker culture and hip hop culture and those things, as well as I think the other thing that really kind of pushed me into, I think I didn't know this at the time, but my interest in anime, or specifically Robotech and Macross as a child, and drawing these mechanized creatures and mechanized worlds, was something that really influenced me into getting into architecture. But when I started in architecture, it was more of I had to choose something to study, and I didn't know what to choose, but I knew I liked to draw, I knew I liked to make things, I knew I liked to design, and I didn't like to study. And the combination of those three things, all those things, made me feel like architecture was a good fit. And even as I studied it, I don't know if I knew that it was a good fit. So I studied here at USC, at the University of Southern California, largely because they offered me scholarships, and largely because they sold my mother, in the fact that they told my mother that USC was the largest feeder school to Harvard Graduate School of Design for their MArch program. And so when my mother heard that, she said, you're going to USC, and I grew up here in LA, so I thought it was a great fit, and it was a great decision. I really enjoyed my time here, but I do feel like my path to becoming an architect is not something that was straightforward in that sense. When I finished here at USC, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be an architect. I had an interest in design. I was one of the first students in the school to start getting into computational design and computer-aided design. And so at that time, I was really interested in going into motion graphics and going into the Hollywood industry and getting into animation. But my father convinced me that I just spent the last 5 years studying architecture, and that I should at least try the professional side before I abandoned it. Because if I started architecture, I would be going into it with a head start as a profession. If I went into animation or the Hollywood industry, I would be starting from zero. If I decided to change my mind later and go back to architecture, then I would have to start architecture at zero. But if I did architecture first and then decided to go to animation, I would start at the same place I would have started, which is at zero. Once I started working, and I worked for a very large firm called AECOM. At that time, it was called DMJM, Daniel Mann Johnson Mendenhall, and we were purchased by AECOM. I got my first building built, and that was when I decided I wanted to do architecture. It was when I saw that building being constructed that I spent so much time working on, and I remember running on the job site, like going down the construction site and going, that's grid line A, that's grid line B, that's grid line, and I was so excited. And that's when I decided to go back to graduate school, because that's when I realized, yes, I wanted to be an architect, but no, that's not the type of architecture I wanted to do. And I realized then that I wanted to go to the AA in London and do my graduate studies there. In terms of origin, I have a very complex origin story. And my origin story, number one, is that I'm an immigrant American, or the child of an immigrant American. So my parents migrated to the US from Taiwan, but they were born in China. And I was born in the Midwest in Minnesota and moved to Los Angeles when I was 9. And I lived in Los Angeles for most of my life until my late 20s when I moved to London. And then London, I spent 9 years before moving back to LA. And so I would say my cultural origin is in Chinese culture. My native cultural origin is actually American, entirely American. My birth, or let's say, culture of becoming an adult is in Los Angeles, but my origin of, let's say, becoming a fully realized architect and designer was in London. And London was the place where I really developed my professional and intellectual attitude towards architecture and the type of architecture that I want to do. America was where I developed my personal attitudes towards culture and an appreciation of the world around me. I absolutely have mentors, and I think that's one of the keys to have any type of success in the world is to have mentors. So I've worked for a number of really great architecture offices and architecture firms. I worked for Zaha Hadid Architects. I've worked for Future Systems and Amanda Levite Architects. And I would say Patrick Schumacher has been a huge mentor of mine from Zaha Hadid Architects while I was in London, as has Hanif Kara from Adams Kara Taylor, structural engineer who was a great mentor. Tom Verabs and Brett Steele from the AA. Brett now at UCLA, Tom now at New Jersey Institute of Technology. Both of them are fantastic mentors that have guided me intellectually and professionally. And then here in Los Angeles, I've been really, really fortunate to have a number of various mentors, whether they're Tom Main, Neil Denari, Larry Scarpa, Lorcan O'Harely, Patrick Teig, fantastic architects that have really, taught me a lot and connected me to a lot of different things and people and places here in LA. I think professors and mentors overlap, but they're not synonymous. Like, you don't have to be a mentor to be a professor, and you don't have to be a professor to be a mentor. I think the goal is for all professors to be mentors, but it doesn't mean they all are. And I think that mentors are, like, let's say in a perfect world, professors are mentors, right? Because I think one of the things that I like to talk a lot about as the director of the graduate program here is that when you're moving through your academic career from, let's say, grade school to high school to university to graduate school to your PhD, at each step you become closer and closer and closer to becoming a peer to the people in front of you, right? Like the people that are teaching you. And when you enter graduate school or when you enter the profession, the people that are your mentors or your faculty or your instructors are very close to becoming peers, meaning the conversations you have with them are not just about them sharing information that they have, teaching you things that you don't know. It's also about them giving access to you about things that they have experienced or that they have lived or that they have access to that you don't, and giving you a window into how those things work or opportunities to rethink the way that you do things based off of experiences they have had. And I do think that that threshold between professor and mentor is one that becomes much more personal, right? Where the professor still exists in an academic setting and is focused on scholarly guidance, whereas the mentor is much more personal, right? And it may be personal related towards a discipline, it may be personal related to intellectual or professional endeavors, but it is still a personal motivation that comes with helping an individual as opposed to, let's say, educating a class or a course or a roster of students. Tom Main told me, one of the things that Tom Main told me in terms of applying for awards is that keep applying until they relent. So like if you have a project that you believe in and you think deserves an award, you submit it for that award. If it doesn't win, submit it again next year. Submit it again the year after. Submit it again the year after. Because every year it's a different jury. Every year it's a different group of people. And eventually they will give in. they will give you the award. Larry Scarpa of Brooks Scarpa, he told me that this is a really important one for me as a small practitioner and owner of a firm that was out there, I'm out there doing work, trying to get work and operate my practice. And one of the things he told me about business development is that you can't wait until you're hungry to start hunting, right? So if you want to live off of the food that you kill, you can't wait until you finish the meal to go hunting. You have to hunt while you still have food. Another one that was really interesting for me came from Neil Denari. And Neil Denari told me, I'm now 45, I'm in my mid 40s. And I was complaining to him, feels like not that long ago, but now I realize because of the pandemic, it was 2 years ago. I was complaining to him about the fact that it was hard for me to find work and that I'm trying to develop the office and grow it. And he said, one of the things about being in your mid 40s in the type of career that I've had, or let's say these academic adjacent careers of looking at experimental architecture and innovative and quote unquote avant-garde architectural practices, is that you reach a certain point in your career, and he identified the mid 40s as the most troublesome period, which is you've developed enough cachet through doing installations, exhibitions, pavilions and things like that, that has gotten you awards and publications and kind of enough internal disciplinary regard that makes you feel like you've graduated to the next level. But then you go to the next level and the clients and stakeholders and decision makers at that next level, your installations, exhibitions, and pavilions have zero credibility and zero cachet, right? Like they don't care that you did a really great pavilion because that has nothing to do with their high-rise tower. And so now you're suddenly working on a whole new different game of cachet and trying to develop that expertise and credibility. In terms of starting my own practice, that was a decision that was fueled by a lot of chance situations. The first chance situation was the fact that the economic crisis of 2008 occurred. Not meaning I was no longer with a job. I still had my job. I was a director at Amanda Levite Architects, and I was responsible for the projects in Asia. But I would say more so the chance that I had saved a lot of money, my wife and I, and we were intending to purchase a house in London. But then because of that economic crisis, suddenly it required 40% down to purchase a house, and that made it impossible. Like I didn't have that kind of savings. And two, I would say, is the fact that there was a growing confidence that was given to me by the fact that I was responsible for a number of clients that kept coming back to me for more projects, which I talked about with my wife, and I realized that, if I've developed a strong enough relationship for them to keep coming back for projects, then it's me they're looking for. And then two, I would say, is the sort of opportunity to teach as a tangent or a support system. And so I was fortunate enough to be recruited to a few teaching positions at the same time, and managed to convince my wife in saying that, I was very interested in teaching. I've always been interested in teaching. Teaching has been something that has been part of my interest ever since I got into architecture. All of the architects I most admired all throughout my career were those that happened to teach as well. And that was very clear to me. But it also became very clear to me that there was a financial reason for that as well, apart from the intellectual reasons. And that's that those that teach can have an income that from the teaching that helps subsidize their personal, let's say, design endeavors as an outlet. And so the combination of all of those things happened, which allowed me to convince my wife that I would gamble on myself, quit my job. I had enough money to saved up that we could live for about a year. I told her that I was interested in teaching. I was not interested in being a pure academic. I wanted to teach and have a practice, but I did not want to start the practice while I was teaching, meaning I did not want the start of the practice to be a part-time endeavor. So I quit my job, rented an office space in London, a desk from my good friend Marcy Song and her practice scene design, rented a desk there, started a practice, quote unquote, created a website, found a name, set up standards, started writing an office profile, trying to define who we were, started trying to enter competitions and do things like that. And by pure chance, and then while I was doing that, that process also prepared me for teaching, because at the same time, it was a similar process of trying to connect the dots through my entire career of what I had done, what I was interested in, what are the things that are important to me as an intellectual, as an architect, as a designer, as a maker, as a creator, as an educator, that helped me write my personal statement and my teaching statement and my research statement in terms of defining, one, what the office was about, but two, what my pedagogy and my research was about. And I was very fortunate that all of those things worked out, and I was able to land a tenure track role here at USC. Came back, had started the office in London. My first employee was a guy named David Wolthers, who was able to join me also only because of the financial crisis. So David, I had just started the practice, and I was on David's final reviews at the AA, and he had sent me an email and said that I was on his final reviews, and he really enjoyed my comments, and he'd heard through the grapevine that I had started an office, and that because of the financial crisis, it was impossible to find a job, and that while he was looking for a job, he would much rather work for me for free than sit around doing nothing. And so I interviewed him, and I promised him, I told him, I said, look, I'll hire you and you can come work with me. I can't pay you right now, but I will buy you lunch and dinner every day. And as soon as I can, I will pay you, because I don't believe in people working for free. He worked for me for 2 months before I finally we entered a competition together, lost, was able to get my first commission. After that first commission paid me my first paycheck, I back paid him for 2 months. And then once I got the job here at USC and moved to Los Angeles, I actually brought him with me and then moved him here to Los Angeles. And he was here for a couple of years before going back to Copenhagen. But that was sort of the story of how the practice started as well as the teaching started. All public architecture in the United States, whether it's civic or government or commercial, cultural, okay, not commercial, but all of the public architecture is done through an RFQ process, which is a request for qualifications, which doesn't say anything about the quality of the work that you've done. It only says, how many of these have you done in the last year? On time, on budget, same size, same scale, same whatever. So if you're trying to get a project that is a library, tell me how many, in the last 3 years, how many libraries you built that were on time, on budget. And if it's 0, you don't show up on the list, which means how do you get on the list if you've never done, And so that's a big issue. I think competitions don't really happen here in the same way that they do in other countries. Licensure is a big issue, and I think that's something that is being debated here. Monica Ponce de Leon at Princeton had a really great article about trying to remove licensure as a hurdle. that saying that if you graduate with a degree in architecture, that should be enough for you to qualify as an architect. But I think there's a lot of, let's say, issues that are specific to the United States that are, as you said, I think the rise of corporate architecture is something, is that these large corporate firms have grown to the size that they have, but then because they've grown to the sizes they have, they need to keep feeding themselves. And the only way to keep feeding themselves is not just to take the big projects, it's to take all the projects. And because they're big enough, they can lose money on one project and cover up that money with money from another project. And they can, as long as the food keeps coming in, the wheels can keep turning. Whereas a firm like myself, I've been very, very fortunate that the firm has been able to survive and grow. But at the same time, it's survived and grown to the point where sometimes I find myself on the same lists as those firms, where I'm competing with a Zaha or a Gensler or an SOM or something like that for a project. And sometimes it's actually shocking to me that my prices are still higher than theirs. But that's also because sometimes I have to charge you what it costs me. They, as I said, can manipulate the system a little bit in terms of keeping money going from other sources to, move things around. My day-to-day right now is wildly different. This is one of the few days in the past year and a half that I'm not at home, right? And so I'm here in my office at USC because I'm going to be teaching an in-person course for incoming graduate students. But also, my day-to-day is all over the place, mostly spent on Zoom right now. I'm at home in my home office while my kids are at home in school. And, my office is now fully remote. So I typically spend the mornings on a Zoom with my team, discussing their tasks for the day, what they've done, checking on the progress on projects and setting up new milestones. Then later we'll probably have a coordination meeting with a project team, then spend the rest of my day in various administrative meetings for the university, sometimes meeting with students, sometimes meeting with faculty, other times meeting with other administrators. And I would say this is probably very typical of most architects and most educators and designers as well, is that the more involved I become in the field of architecture and the process of being an architect and having my own firm and moving from being a faculty member to a director of a program, is that I have to learn to let go and learn to accept being a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further from the actual process of having my hands touching the actual model, or actually drawing the actual lines, or modeling the actual splines, or writing the actual code to actually do things. Yeah, but also I think that's one of the things about architectural education, in that sense of, I actually just showed this diagram to my students the other day, and I put a diagram up which was called the lenses of architecture. And it was a 3-part Venn diagram. And in one part, I put the discipline, the other part I put the profession, and the other part I put the commons. And I think this is an issue we have in architecture in particular, which is there's a way that we talk about architecture which is about the discipline, meaning it's the conversation we have with each other, architects for architects. Then there's the conversation we have for the profession, which is not as intellectual architects, but as professional architects, and the conversations we have with builders and contractors and engineers and consultants. And then the commons, that's the conversation that we have about with mayors and with decision makers and maybe clients and with the clients kind of crosses over to the profession as well, depending on the client. But there's the kind of way that the work is received or discussed to a mainstream public, to a profession, and to an internal discipline. And I think that's something that most architects, including myself, struggle with, in that you tend to be really strong at one and bad at two. Or, as they always say, that you can be, the other Venn diagram they always talk about is that you can have something that's high quality, fast, or on budget, but you can't have all three, right? So you have to pick two. You can be high quality and on budget, but not fast. Or you could be fast and on budget, but not high quality. And I think it's a similar situation when thinking about architecture and these three, like it's hard for architects to be able to do all three, right? And the architects that are really good at selling themselves to the profession and really good at selling themselves to the public tend to lose favor with the discipline, right? Like if you think about Bjarke as an example, when he started, he was the profession, or he was the discipline and the public. He kept the public, but moved from the discipline to the profession, right? And now he's building things, and they're really delivering. They're still super popular in the public eye, but they're no longer part of the disciplinary conversation. And I think that's something that is a struggle to be able to keep that, and I don't know if there's a way to do it. Yeah, well, I mean, it was Peter Eisenman, American architect, that kind of made the statement that architecture is an autonomous discipline, like it's its own thing, right? And he really kind of accentuated that. But I do think that we can be, it's not mutually exclusive. Like we can be our own thing. There's a version of it which is its own thing, but it still has to be related to the external public and the world around us. And as well as the fact that I think right now we're living in a time where, whether it's systemic racism, environmental crisis, gentrification, homelessness, lack of resources or equal resources, the world around us is actually almost entirely the biggest issues in the world around us are almost entirely being driven by issues regarding the built environment, regarding things that architecture actually touches. And we have an ability to think in a way that is highly creative and imaginative, not just utilitarian. And I think it's actually the most imaginative, creative, and innovative solutions that are going to change those things rather than the most utilitarian. So historically, my pedagogy and my research has revolved around issues of computation in architecture and thinking about how to leverage technology, whether it's design computation, digital fabrication, emerging technologies, as opportunities to think about how we can challenge convention in architectural practice and architectural thinking, whether it's through thinking about formal systems or fabrication systems and things like that. But I think as times have changed and as I've evolved and as society around me has evolved, as well as my own kind of personal beliefs coming to the forefront, one of the things I'm really, really becoming quite interested in terms of not only my teaching, but let's say my practice, and most importantly, right now, the directorship of this graduate program, is really thinking about how these things can be leveraged to illustrate what I feel architecture really is. And what I feel architecture really is the expression or materialization of value systems in the built environment. And so it isn't necessarily about personal value systems all the time. It is about societal or cultural value systems, or the value systems of our clients, our stakeholders, the communities we build in, the people we build for. And if you think about that as what architecture is, it's really interesting for me to look back on my own architectural career and how it has crossed over different periods of time. And similar to the way you think about like things like music or literature or movies, you can look back on certain movies or music right now and you can identify either by the sound or by the lyrics or by the content or by the attitude what era that music was created in, right? Because there's a certain zeitgeist of that era. Some of it is aesthetic, some of it is political, some of it is cultural. All of it is contextual. And I think right now we can very clearly see that, like, I let's say came of age in a pre-2008, on that cusp of the global economic crisis period in architecture, where computation was first emerging and the global economy was doing fantastic. And it was a period where if you threw enough money at something, you could build anything, right? And at that time, I was working for Zaha and Future Systems and Amanda Levitt's office, and me and my friends joked that we felt like we were architectural James Bonds. Like every week, we're flying to another city in another place, going to a different client in Dubai or China or wherever, and presenting projects that were exorbitant and extravagant and over the top, and people were buying it. And then 2008 happens, and the world economic crisis shifts everything, and suddenly, architecture becomes far more austere. And now 2020, 21 happens, and we have the pandemic, we have the return of the civil rights movement 2.0 or in this country, and an environmental crises coming back to the forefront. And all of these things are shifting, and I think architecture as a whole, much like the rest of the world, is repositioning itself to rethink itself in these relative terms. And for myself, it's really thinking about how the same issues that I've always believed in terms of computation and technology and the things that I believe have always shifted or created the paradigm shifts of architecture have been technological shifts. But now I'm beginning to realize that they're technological shifts paired with social and cultural shifts. And so those things are things where, I guess, one of my favorite quotes is from Cedric Price, the late architect from the AA in the 1960s. And he had a title of a lecture, which is Technology is the Answer, but What is the Question? And I think right now, that's, for me, the bigger question is what can technology, if technology historically, or at least when I came of age, was used to answer technological questions, that's of no more interest, right? Like, people don't really care about the technology anymore, but they do care what the technology can produce, right? Like they don't care how we got Facebook. They just like to use it, right? Like the social, cultural ramifications are of interest, not the technological ones. Myself, having studied at the AA, there were tons of Latin American students. They were, Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, like all over. But I would say 95% of them were the 3% of wealth in that country, right? Like they're all coming from, they're the wealthy of those places, and that's why they could afford to go study in London, right? And so, like, you are taking an elite group, displacing them, filling them with the ideas of another elite group, and then asking them to return. And so I do think that's a particular context. But I also think that there is a part of that which is, that's something we are really trying to do here at USC, as like, there's a term that our dean, Milton Curry, has been using called the citizen architect. And that's the sort of mantra of the school, which is we're a school for citizen architects, which is that we see architecture as bigger than the buildings, right? It's actually the role of those buildings and ourselves as architects as citizens, as part of a society, as part of a culture, as part of a larger sequence of forces acting on that built environment. But I think that's also one of the things that we like to sell about the program, is that because we are in Los Angeles, which is a major global metropolis that has some of the most significant architecture in the world, has some of the most significant architecture practices in the world, some of the most significant architecture schools in the world, but also has some of the most significant urban problems in the world, right? So like we have everything that I just mentioned in terms of homelessness, gentrification, traffic, resource scarcity, pollution, environmental crises, changing weather, like all of the systemic racism, all of these things are right here in full display, from the things you want to study because they're good, like the amazing architecture and the amazing firms, but also all of the things that you want to study because they're problems to solve. I think the hardest thing to learn to do through my architectural career has been to let go. And I think letting go is something that is difficult to describe, but I do think that part of it is not having a preconception of what I want to be doing before I'm doing it. Where I think in the beginning of my architectural process, everything was, I felt like I had to have an idea to create something. But sometimes, oftentimes, more often than not, actually, I would say the idea comes out of doing something rather than having the idea to do it, right? Like you have to do things, you have to set the wheels in motion for the ideas to come. And that was a hard thing for me to come to terms with. The hardest thing that I'm trying to do right now and that I'm trying to learn is probably actually what we just talked about, which is trying to figure out how to connect my own work in more substantial ways with things that I believe in personally, like being anti-racist, with being pro-environment, with being equitable in the world in terms of thinking about larger societal problems, and how design can contribute to those through my actual practice, than just saying it, right? Because right now it's easy for me to say it and talk about it, but it's very hard to actually prove it through the actual work and say that the work is doing that without me saying it.